It was the faint orange shimmer against the walls that drew me, though in truth, Oxford's nights are always full of half-lights and half-secrets. I had been walking, as I often did when sleep seemed too insistent on eluding me, along the narrow lanes between college and river. The mist was thick, curling like smoke over the cobbles, softening each step until all sound was the dull tap of leather against stone. I saw the lantern then, swinging slightly in the wind from its iron bracket, casting a restless halo that picked out the wet sheen of the pavement. There was nothing unusual in a lantern burning by a doorway, yet there was something too, a wrongness so quiet it felt almost polite. I paused, letting the air rest against my face, the faint smell of coal smoke drifting above the sharper tang of damp stone. The door beneath the lantern was closed, though the hour suggested no visitor should have been expected. I felt a tug of memory, something from a crossword clue earlier that evening, illumination that conceals as well as reveals. I had thought of a lantern then. Its glow is both light and shadow. What it shows is never the whole. I told myself I had no business there, that solitude and whiskey were far better companions than curiosity. Yet I stayed. My eyes traced the sill, the brass letter plate, the faint scuff of a shoe against wood that seemed too recent to belong to anyone respectable. One of the peculiarities of detective work, I suppose, is how quickly the mind turns a doorstep into a stage, and an ordinary smudge into an overture. A sound reached me then, muffled, uncertain, something between a sigh and the scrape of fabric. I shifted slightly, leaning closer to the brickwork, though I made no movement to knock. It came again, that faint stir, not speech, not quite, but enough to suggest a presence, reluctant or trapped. I left it, as one must sometimes. Not every whisper belongs to the policeman's ear. But I carried the image with me down the lane, the solitary lantern, the house behind it refusing entry, and the small exhalation of someone hidden inside. Later at Randolph, Lewis sat across from me nursing a pint. His loyalty was as steady as the bitter in his glass. I told him, lightly, about the lantern. He smiled at my fondness for apparitions where others would see nothing more than gaslight and mist. He said he had once seen a fox by Magdalen Bridge, and for a week I had insisted it was a dog escaping its master. It amused him that I could entertain murder in an empty corridor yet deny a fox on the bridge. But beneath his easy grin, I felt his watchfulness. He knew that when I spoke of lanterns, it was rarely about lanterns at all. I suppose I was testing the waters of my own instinct, putting out the faintest line to see whether he would tug back. He did not. Instead, he asked if I had finished the crossword in the Times. I told him, almost, but not quite. There was still that clue, illumination that conceals. The evening turned to night, and the whiskey turned to water. Still I could not quite let go of the sound from behind that door. I replayed it in my mind as though it were music, an incomplete bar, the final note withheld. The next morning, rain washed Oxford into its familiar greys and silvers. I stood at the gate of the Bodleian, watching students pass with arms full of books, and thought again of the lantern. The image pressed against my mind like a finger against glass. I considered returning, though I had no warrant, no reason beyond unease. Yet experience had taught me that reason seldom announced itself in neat syllogisms. It crept instead, through lanterns and scuffs and muffled sighs. I wandered into the library, not for study but for refuge. The smell of parchment steadied me, that particular perfume of age and ink. I sat with a volume of Donne, though I hardly read it. What I did notice, however, was the young woman across the aisle. She was restless, leafing through pages as though they held secrets that kept dissolving when she tried to grasp them. Her hair fell across her cheek, and now and then she brushed it back with a hand too sharp in movement, too anxious. I thought of the lantern again, light and shadow, concealment and revelation. When she left, she dropped a slip of paper. I bent and retrieved it, though she had already vanished between the stacks. It was not a note, but a torn receipt from a modest shop in Jericho. Nothing remarkable except for the name scrawled faintly on the back. I will not repeat it now. It would mean little to anyone hearing this, and yet it meant enough to me at that moment to fold the scrap into my pocket as though it were treasure. Names, after all, are lanterns too. Lewis found me later, frowning over a sandwich that had too much mustard. He asked if I was following anyone in that way of his that was both jest and suspicion. I said no. He asked if I was unwell. I said nothing. He let it rest. He always did. By dusk I'd walked back toward that lane. The lantern still glowed, faint against the wet air, though it seemed dimmer now. Or perhaps it was my own expectation dimming it. The door was still closed. I lingered again, though I told myself it was foolish. Then I noticed what I had missed the night before, a faint crack along the lower pane of the window. Barely visible unless you bent close, the sort of detail a householder might cover with a curtain, but not repair. It was then I realised what had been troubling me most. The lantern itself, not its glow, but its timing. Oxford's college lanterns, its private ones too, are lit and snuffed with monotonous regularity. Yet this one had burned too long. The wick was uneven, the glass smudged with the soot of neglect. A forgotten lantern, or one left burning for reasons no neighbour had noticed. Illumination that conceals. I stood there, knowing only that whatever case it might be had already begun. The morning had already surrendered to drizzle when I returned to the Bodleian. Oxford breathes differently and rain its stones draw in the damp, darken, and then give it back in faint whispers beneath one's shoes. I had no pressing business there, but libraries have always offered me the illusion of purpose when purpose itself was evasive. A detective without a case is like a lantern without oil. You may carry it proudly, but it burns nothing. I walked slowly through Duke Humphreys, past shelves that seemed to bend under the weight of centuries. There is a sound particular to such rooms, the hush of paper, the weary sigh of a page turned after too much handling. Students crouched over their notes, their pens moving with frantic regularity, as though salvation could be summoned by sheer graphite. For my part, I allowed my eyes to wander, pretending to read titles while my mind drifted back to the receipt the young woman had left behind. A name scribbled hastily, almost concealed in its haste. I had not yet decided if it was worth remembering, though memory, once engaged, rarely affords us that luxury. It was while leaning against the end of a stack, watching dust drift like tiny constellations in the air, that I noticed the librarian. A man of indeterminate age, somewhere between youth's impatience and old age's resignation. He moved with an anxious precision, arranging books not because they needed arranging, but because his hands needed occupation. His eyes flicked toward the reading desks more often than was necessary. He did not belong to the furniture as librarians usually do. He seemed aware of his body, as though performing the role rather than inhabiting it. I thought, not for the first time, of a crossword clue I had struggled with the evening before. A keeper of words who hides them, 6 letters. I had written warden, then crossed it out, unsettled by the insufficiency. Watching him, I wondered if the answer lay closer to hand. It was then the moment arrived. A student, careless with her satchel, knocked a pile of papers from the table. The librarian darted forward, almost too quickly, and as he bent to help, a letter slipped from his sleeve. White against black cloth, it fell unnoticed to the floor beside my shoes. He didn't see it. He returned the books with a faint bow, his face neutral, his hands again arranging. But the letter remained. I did not pick it up immediately. I looked at it as one might look at an animal caught in the wrong place, aware that a single movement could alter everything. Its paper was thick, the sort that suggests importance before one even reads a word. The corner bore the faint trace of sealing wax, broken. I bent casually, as though adjusting my shoelace, and slipped it into my pocket. The guilt was immediate, irrational. There is something about a library that magnifies transgression. Every theft of silence feels louder there. Later, in the dim alcove beneath the staircase, I unfolded it. The handwriting was hurried, angular, the kind produced not by habit, but by desperation. It was a brief 2 lines, no signature. The lantern will remain lit until Friday. After that, all debts are ended. I read it twice, then folded it again. It should have meant nothing, a private matter obscure in its context, yet the words settled heavily upon me. The lantern again. Friday as deadline. Debts ended. Lewis joined me that afternoon at the pub near St. Giles. He carried an umbrella too small for his shoulders, which amused me. Over pints I considered mentioning the letter but decided against it. He spoke of football, of a neighbour's dog that barked at inopportune hours, of the inspector who had taken too fond a liking to cheap cigars. I listened without listening, my mind circling the lantern, the words of the letter repeated in rhythm with the rain against the window. When he asked if something was wrong, I said only that the crossword had been unsatisfying lately. He smiled, unconvinced. He has always known when I'm pursuing something in silence, yet he has also known not to press. That evening I returned once more to the Bodleian, not for books but for the librarian. He was there, of course, his movements no less precise, but now I looked closer. His shoes were scuffed unevenly, as though his gait had changed recently. His fingers bore faint stains of ink, but also of something darker, perhaps oil. His cuff was frayed at one edge. I thought again of the letter slipping from that sleeve. It had been too easy, too visible. A man so careful would not drop something by chance. Had he wanted me to find it? The idea lingered unpleasantly. I dislike being manipulated, yet I have never been immune to it. A detective is as much a servant of suggestion as of evidence. I left the library unsettled. The rain had grown harder, beating against the lanterns that lined the high street, each one casting its circle of light like a watchful eye. I thought of Friday again. It was only Wednesday. 2 days until something ended, if the letter were to be believed. But what? A debt? A life? That night I poured whiskey, more than I should have, and worked through the crossword. One clue caught me, light that signals an ending, 5 letters. I wrote flame, then hesitated. I tried the torch, still wrong. At last, reluctantly, I wrote death. It fits too well. The next morning I returned to the library earlier than usual. Few students had arrived. The air smelled of polish and damp coats. I searched the desks, the shelves, the reading room, but the librarian was absent. The absence itself became the clue. A man so meticulous does not fail to appear without cause. At the reference desk I asked after him. The assistant frowned, said he'd not been in since yesterday, left no explanation. She said it lightly, but her eyes betrayed unease. She added that he had seemed distracted for weeks, and once, when she had asked, after his health, he had muttered something about a debt he could not pay. I left then, the letter burning in my pocket. Outside the rain had paused, leaving Oxford in that uncertain hour when the sky could not decide between surrender and reprieve. The lanterns along the street had been extinguished, all except one, the same lantern glowing still. It is Thursday now, tomorrow will be Friday. And I knew, as surely as I knew my own name, that the letter was not a relic of the past, but a herald of what was yet to come. I stood there, watching its glow against the stone, and realised I had become a keeper of words myself. The librarian's letter, the woman's receipt, the crossword clues. They were fragments, scattered, demanding to be read together, though they refused to form a sentence. I lit a cigarette, though I barely smoked half of it. The taste of ash clung bitter at the back of my throat. Friday loomed, and all debts, it seemed, were not yet ended. There are deaths that fade into the fabric of Oxford, as natural as ivy reclaiming stone, and then there are others that never leave, that linger like the scent of damp wool in a room long after its occupant has gone. I was reminded of one such death that week, though I cannot say whether the reminder came from a conversation, a chance phrase overheard, or the simple trickery of memory when the city is wet and sleepless. What I do recall is how it rose to the surface with the persistence of something unburied. Years ago, a student was found in the reading room at All Souls. He'd collapsed over a volume of Milton, his hand still curled around the page as though unwilling to let the verse go. The coroner wrote it off as natural causes, an undiagnosed defect of the heart, they said. Yet the detail that lodged in my mind was not the heart but the shoes. He had been wearing them unlaced, an oddity for a young man so otherwise immaculate. The proctors considered it trivial. I did not. An unlaced shoe is the kind of accident that reveals an earlier struggle, or a sudden haste no scholar ordinarily allows himself. I had thought of it then, and I thought of it now because of the librarian. His shoes bore that same uneven scuff, the mark of someone walking not with rhythm but with interruption, as if the body had been asked to stop suddenly or flee. A gesture too subtle for most, perhaps. For me it was the shadow of an earlier death stepping into the present. Lewis and I walked that morning along Broad Street. He was telling me about a cousin's wedding, the petty arguments over seating, the absurdity of distant uncles deciding themselves indispensable to the head table. His words reached me dimly, as though through water. I caught myself asking, had he ever heard of a student dying in All Souls' library? He looked at me with that mixture of patience and worry he reserves for such moments. He said yes, faintly, that there had been talk of it once, though he had forgotten the details. Forgotten, he said, because it had been nothing more than a tragedy, and tragedies are not crimes. I said nothing further. I had learned to stop pressing when his silence grew heavier than his speech. We passed under the bridge of sighs, the drizzle curling downward like smoke, and I thought again of the letter in my pocket. Debts ended, Friday looming, and a death remembered long beyond its explanation. That afternoon I found myself at the college archives, requesting files under a pretence too thin even for me. The archivist, an austere woman with hands like bird claws, produced a folder tied with twine. The student's name stared back at me in fading ink. His photograph, clipped to the page, showed an intelligent face, narrow, with eyes that gave nothing away. The report itself was sparse. Cause of death, myocardial failure. Witness statements brief, dutiful. But one detail returned again, the testimony of a porter who had found the shoes unlaced. He had thought it odd enough to mention, though his remark was dismissed. There was also a line, scribbled hastily in the margin of one page, letter recovered unclaimed. No copy of the letter was preserved, only the faint reminder that it had once existed. I sat with it for a long time, the silence of the archive heavy around me, letters, lanterns, debts, always words left behind, always something written and never explained. I wondered if the librarian had known the student. Perhaps he had been a junior staff member then, unseen, moving among the shelves while others made their careers. Oxford is nothing if not a house of echoes. When I returned the file, the archivist gave me a long look. She asked, almost idly, if I had known him. I said no. She nodded, though her eyes remained on me. She said she remembered the day of his death clearly because the light had gone out suddenly in one of the reading lamps and had to be relit. She said it had felt like an omen. I made a polite sound, but the words stayed with me. Light extinguished, then relit. Lanterns again. That evening I returned once more to the Bodleian. The librarian was still absent. In his place, the assistant manned the desk. I asked after him casually, but she grew guarded. She said only that he was unwell, though her voice wavered on the last syllable. I wandered the aisles until dusk, the books casting their silent judgment. When the bell rang for closing, I lingered by the desk. A student dropped off a pile of volumes, careless, one sliding to the floor. As the assistant bent to retrieve it, a letter slipped from between the pages. For the second time in as many days, I found myself staring at words that should not have been left to chance. This one bore a single line in the same hurried hand. Do not forget death. It will be remembered. I folded it quickly, my heart tightening with that peculiar sensation of déjà vu one only feels when history begins repeating itself too precisely. It was not addressed, not signed. But it tied the librarian, the absent man, to the death at All Souls with a thread I could no longer pretend not to see. Outside, the rain had begun again. The lantern glowed still, stubborn against the wet, its halo blurred but not diminished. I watched it until the streets emptied. The city felt complicit somehow, every stone holding back the words it had overheard but never spoken. Back in my room, I poured whiskey and laid both letters side by side. One spoke of debts ending on Friday, the other of a death that would not be forgotten. Together they hummed like two notes on a violin, unresolved, vibrating towards some unseen chord. I returned to my crossword. The clue was memory that refuses erasure, 9 letters. I tried persistence, then indelible, neither fit. At last, with reluctance, I wrote haunting, and I thought, yes, that was the word. The past does not remain. It haunts me. I closed the book without finishing it. Outside the lantern burned, inside the letters waited, and the death, long remembered, waited too. Friday was tomorrow. By Friday morning, Oxford seemed to have wrapped itself in a heavier silence than usual. The rain had thinned to a mist, the sort that does not fall so much as drift, softening edges, smothering distance. I woke with the taste of whiskey still lodged in the back of my throat, and the letter's words folded too neatly in my memory. Debts ended. A death remembered. Friday. The lantern would burn until then. I went to the Bodleian early, not because I expected the librarian to return, but because absence is often more revealing than presence. The assistant was there again, her eyes rimmed with fatigue. She offered me the faintest nod as though we'd already agreed on a pact of silence. No mention of the missing man, no reference to the letter she had accidentally revealed. She moved with a kind of guarded composure, her hands too careful with the books, her gaze too fixed on routine. Guilt, perhaps, or fear. Oxford, I've always thought, arranges its secrets in circles, colleges, cloisters, quadrangles, all designed to keep things both visible and concealed. And so it was with those who lingered around the matter of the lantern. They were drawn into an unspoken circle, whether they knew it or not. There was the assistant with her watchful eyes, the young woman who had left behind the receipt with a name, the librarian himself, now vanished, the archivist who remembered the student's death more vividly than the document suggested, and though he would not have wished it, Lewis himself, because proximity to me has always meant proximity to trouble. I sat at a desk in the lower reading room, pretending to leaf through a volume of Donne again, while my mind arranged the faces. Each seemed plausible in guilt, and equally plausible in innocence. That is the trouble with Oxford. Everyone here is clever enough to be guilty, and proud enough to hide it well. Around midday, the assistant brought me a slip of paper with the book I had requested. Her hand lingered too long, and her eyes met mine for an instant too direct. It was nothing, yet I read it as something. People betray themselves not in their words, but in the half-seconds they forget to mask. I considered following her later, but a more pressing thought occurred. The young woman with the receipt. She had been restless, impatient, moving through pages as though pursued. The name she had scrawled on the back of that scrap had been familiar, though I had not admitted it at first, not even to myself. It was the same surname as the student who had died years ago in All Souls. Perhaps a coincidence. Oxford is riddled with repeating names. Yet the detail clung to me like smoke in my hair. I left the library and walked across to Jericho, the rain greasing the stones until the pavements shone like oil. The shop named on the receipt was modest, a narrow station with faded awnings. Inside, the air smelled of paper, ink, and a faint trace of mildew. The proprietor, a man with spectacles that magnified his eyes absurdly, told me little. Yes, the young woman had purchased paper there often. No, he did not know her name. But when I described her, he nodded too quickly as though rehearsed. He added after a pause that she had been seen in the company of a mantle, pale, with hair gone thin at the temples. He said it without prompting, and I knew he had been waiting to give me that detail, though not to the police. The description, though vague, unsettled me. It sounded not unlike the librarian. I returned to my rooms as evening fell, the city dissolving into damp shadows. The lantern was burning still, casting its glow on the familiar doorway. A circle of suspects and a circle of light. I stood watching it as though it might confess. Lewis came by later. He carried the evening paper, its headlines indifferent to my private obsessions. Over pints he spoke again of football, of trivialities that I could not seem to hold in my head. He asked eventually, in his careful way, if I was working on a case he should know about. I told him only that Oxford was restless. He looked at me for a long time, then said quietly that Oxford had always been restless. It was I who gave that restlessness shape. When he left, I sat alone with the 2 letters, the receipt, and the memory of shoes unlaced. I wrote the names down in a small notebook, circling them. The assistant, the young woman, the librarian, the archivist. Myself, reluctantly, because I have never been as separate from these matters as I pretend. A circle of suspects. Near midnight I turned to the crossword. The clue read, gathered names, linked without proof, 7 letters. I tried suspecting. It fit too well, though the answer unsettled me. I looked out the window. The lantern burned, but faintly now, as if nearing its last oil. Friday was not yet done, and I understood then, not with certainty but with dread, that the circle was closing. The case had ceased to be about a death long remembered. It was about a death that had not yet occurred, or perhaps one waiting to be repeated, and whether I liked it or not was already inside the circle. I have always believed that Oxford hides its truest confessions not in books or sermons, but in the margins of ordinary life. That evening it was hidden in a wine list, folded carelessly into the menu at a small restaurant just off Little Clarendon Street. I had gone there not for company, but for warmth. The rain had seeped through my coat, and whisky, though tempting, seemed too obvious a refuge. The restaurant was nearly empty. A couple at one table whispered in that way which makes every word feel rehearsed. A don, his gown folded awkwardly over the back of a chair, scribbled notes between bites of bread. I sat alone near the window, watching the droplets gather and descend, their rhythm indifferent to human unease. The waiter brought the list. Burgundy, Bordeaux, Claret, Riesling Geich, name a geography of longing. But it was not the vintages that caught me. It was the faint scrawl in pencil at the bottom corner, almost erased. A list of initials, 4 of them. They matched too closely the circle I had drawn in my notebook the night before. The librarian, the assistant, the young woman, the archivist. And there was a 5th, faint, half rubbed out as though regretted M. My own initials. For a moment I thought it was a coincidence. Students amuse themselves with codes and ciphers lists are the currency of boredom. But the paper smelled faintly of ink and wax, the same as the letters I carried in my pocket. And the hands, hurried angular, were identical. I ordered nothing. I simply sat staring at the names, while the waiter shifted impatiently nearby. It was as though the city itself had written me into its ledger of debts. Lewis joined me unexpectedly, dripping rainwater, his hair flattened absurdly. He asked if I was unwell, and I told him the food was poor, though I had not touched it. He glanced at the wine list, asked what I was staring at. I told him nothing, folded it quickly, and slipped it away. He let it pass, though I felt his patience thinning. When he left, I walked back through the streets alone, the list folded against the 2 letters and the receipt. My pocket had become a reliquary of fragments, each accusing me in silence. Back in my rooms, I studied the initials again. They formed no clear order, no sentence. Yet the presence of my own unsettled me more than any accusation could. I suddenly remembered the archivist's remark about the lamp that had extinguished and relit on the day of the student's death. Light, put out and returned. A name, written and erased. Was the 5th letter meant to be me, or someone else who had borne the same mark before me? The crossword lay open on my desk. The clue read, a record of bottles, but also of sins, 8 letters. I wrote a cellarage, then crossed it out. Finally, with a grim smile, I wrote a register. That was what the wine list had become, a register of debts waiting to be ended. I poured whisky after all, against my better judgment. Outside, the lantern glowed faintly still, stubborn, as though unwilling to acknowledge the turning of days. Friday was ending. Saturday would bring no comfort. I sat in the half-light. The wine list spread before me, and understood that I was not only the detective of this circle, I was now one of its suspects. Saturday began with a sky the colour of pewter, heavy and unwilling to move. Oxford always seems more secretive under such a dome, as if the colleges lean closer together, whispering. I walked without much direction, the lantern's stubborn glow still on my mind, until I found myself once again at the archives. It was not a choice so much as a compulsion. I had to know if memory mine or the city was deceiving me. The archivist greeted me with her usual austerity, her hands folded tightly as though restraining speech. She seemed to expect me, though I had not announced myself. There are people in Oxford who have always known when a question is about to be asked, and who have already prepared the answer. She produced a bundle of photographs before I even opened my mouth. They were sepia, the corners brittle, the faces arranged in rigid collegiate rows, students, dons, librarians, assistants, each staring at the camera with the same stiff blend of pride and apprehension. She told me these were from the year of the student's death at All Souls. She left me with them, her steps fading down the corridor like the tick of a distant metronome. I spread the photographs across the long oak table. The air smelled of dust and polish, faintly of candle wax, though none burned, and there he was, the student, his narrow face unmistakable, his eyes giving nothing. But there were others. The librarian, younger, thinner at the cheek, standing just behind him. The archivist herself, though she would not have admitted it. Her hair darker, but the severity already fixed. And beside them, Someone else, the young woman's resemblance unmistakable, though in this case, a boy. A brother, perhaps. The surname beneath confirmed it. The same name as the one on the receipt she had dropped in the Bodleian. A circle again, drawn not by me this time, but by the photograph itself. I studied the edges more closely. There was an anomaly. At the lower corner of one photograph, the outline of a hand extended strangely into the frame, as if belonging to someone cut out of the group. A thumb visible, but nothing else. Why include such a flawed plate among the carefully preserved? Unless, perhaps, it had been overlooked, or perhaps it mattered more than anyone realized. I leaned closer. The thumb was scarred, a small crescent mark across the nail. It was not evidence, not in any legal sense, but memory whispered that I had seen such a mark recently on the archivist's hand as she handed me the file days earlier. I had thought nothing of it then. Now it hummed with meaning, though meaning of what sort I could not say. Lewis found me later at Randolph. He sat across from me, studied my glass before he studied me. He asked what I had been doing all morning. I said only that I had been visiting ghosts. He smiled faintly, saying Oxford was full of them. He pressed no further, but he noticed my restlessness. He always does. We talked of trivialities, though beneath the words I held the image of that photograph. The archivist, the librarian, the student dead, the sibling still present, and the scarred thumb intruding like an afterthought. Each piece fitting without fitting, like letters in a crossword that make sense in isolation but refuse to complete the grid. That evening I returned to my room and spread the photograph on the desk beside the letters, the wine list, and the receipt. It was becoming a collage, an assemblage of fragments pointing to a shape I could not quite discern. I lit a cigarette, though I scarcely smoked half of it, the ash gathering unnoticed. The crossword lay open again, the clue image that captures and betrays 10 letters. I tried to make an impression. I tried revelation. Neither fit. At last I wrote a photograph. It seemed too obvious, but sometimes the obvious is what we resist most. I circled it, as though the act of circling might draw meaning out of chance. Outside, Oxford grew quiet. The lantern still glowed, though faintly, its oil nearly gone. I felt the weight of Friday's promise pressing forward into Saturday night. The debt not yet ended, the death not yet repeated or resolved. I dreamed of the photograph. In the dream the faces moved, rearranging themselves, stepping out of the frame and into the room. The student unlaced his shoes, the librarian held a lantern, the archivist's scarred thumb pointed at me, and the young woman whispered a name I could not quite hear. When I woke, the photograph still lay on the desk, unchanged, but the whisper lingered. I poured whiskey in the early hours, though it did not steady me. Instead, I stared at the photograph until dawn pressed its pale fingers against the glass. A photograph in the archive. A hand that should not have been there. A scar that still existed. A circle of suspects closing tighter, and me at the centre, whether I wished it or not. By Sunday morning the lantern was gone. Its absence startled me more than its glow ever had. The bracket still hung above the door, blackened with soot, but the glass had been removed, the flame extinguished. Oxford without it felt curiously incomplete, as though a word in a sentence had been rubbed out, but the rhythm of the phrase remained. I walked past the empty bracket 3 times that morning, once with deliberate slowness, once with feigned indifference, and once in the way of a man hoping to catch sight of someone else who had noticed. No one did. Students hurried with books tucked under coats. Couples argued softly about Sunday services. A dog splashed through puddles near Holywell. The lantern's disappearance, like its long persistence, seemed to belong to me alone. Back in my room, I poured coffee I did not drink and unfolded the wine list again. The initials stared back at me, stubborn and unresolved. I thought of the photograph in the archive, the scarred thumb intruding where it did not belong. Each clue seemed to point in all directions at once, and that is the worst kind of riddle, the one in which every answer is plausible, and therefore none is true. Lewis arrived unexpectedly, carrying a newspaper folded under his arm. He asked if I had heard the news. I had not. He placed the paper before me, the ink still damp. A body had been found near the canal in Jericho. Male, middle-aged, cause of death not yet released. No identification offered in the early report. I did not say it, but we both thought the same name, the librarian. Lewis asked me directly, "Do you know more than you're telling?" I said only that I knew less than I should. He did not press further, though his silence grew heavier with every sip of his pint later at the pub. By afternoon I'd walked to the canal. Police tape fluttered faintly in the damp breeze, its plastic too bright against the water's dull sheen. A constable, young enough to still believe in procedure, barred me politely. I watched from a distance. The water lapped indifferently, carrying away secrets in ripples. The body, I later learned, was not the librarian. It was a vagrant known by the locals, a man who had lived for years in the shadows of Jericho's crumbling warehouses. No letters in his pocket, no debts recorded in ledgers, no lanterns to his name. A life overlooked, and now a death equally overlooked. The newspapers called it tragic but unsurprising. I knew better. I knew it was meant to distract me, a red herring placed neatly in my path. Oxford is skilled at this. It throws up accidents and coincidences like smoke screens, hoping you will follow them until you forget the trail you were on. The death by the canal was precisely that noise to drown the signal. Yet it unsettled me. A man dead is never only a diversion. Even the wrong death stains. I returned to the Bodleian that evening, though the hour was late and the doors should have been locked. The assistant was still there, her eyes more hollow than before. She seemed surprised to see me, but said nothing. Her silence was heavier than any greeting could have been. I asked about the librarian. She hesitated, then said quietly that he had debts. Yes, but not the kind one could clear with money. She would not explain further. Her hand trembled as she adjusted the catalogue cards. I noticed then the faintest trace of ink on her cuff, smudged where she had tried to wipe it away. A careless gesture, but telling. I thought again of the letter that had slipped from her books days earlier. Do not forget death. It will be remembered. Had it been hers all along, or had she merely carried it for someone else? Later, in my room, I tried the crossword. The clue was a misleading trail, deliberately laid. 11 letters. I wrote subterfuge, then falsehood, neither fit. At last I sighed and wrote red herring. Too obvious again, yet true. The death at the canal, the wine list, the initials, the scarred thumb. Each might be nothing, or each might be designed to lead me astray. A puzzle built not to be solved but to exhaust the solver. I poured whiskey, though it tasted like ash. The lantern was gone, its absence more eloquent than its presence. A man dead in Jericho, though not the right man. A photograph intruding with its scarred thumb. A wine list marking me among the suspects. I leaned back in the chair and let the city speak in silence. Floorboards creaked in rooms I did not inhabit. Rain struck the window with its quiet insistence. Somewhere a bell tolled the hour, its echo dissolving into stone. A red herring, yes, but red herring or not, someone was dead. And someone else had left me in the circle, waiting for the real death to arrive. The worst of it was not the misdirection. The worst of it was knowing that even the lie had teeth. It was in the evening, beneath the dim lamps of the King's Arms, that the verse returned to me, not recited, not read aloud, but half whispered across the room by a student drunk on his own wit. He shouted something about Milton, though his words stumbled over the line. He spoke of light and darkness, but misplaced the order, changing its meaning without realizing. The room laughed, the way students do when they cannot tell the difference between brilliance and error. Yet the error lingered with me. A misquoted verse is no different from a red herring. It leads you away while seeming to take you closer. I had heard the same line misquoted before, not long ago. It took me a moment to recall where. The archivist, standing stiffly in her domain, speaking of the lamp that went out and returned on the day of the student's death. She had said the words almost as though quoting, but wrong deliberately, I think, now that I heard the same error in the pub. She had said darkness before light, when the poet had written it the other way. A small shift, but enough to alter the shape of memory. I left the pub without finishing my drink. The rain had returned, sharp needles against the collar of my coat. The streets shone like black glass. I walked without much sense of direction until I found myself again outside the Bodleian, its bulk rising against the sky like a fortress of silence. The assistant was leaving as I arrived, her umbrella bending against the wind. She seemed startled to see me, then tried to smile. I asked her, without preamble, if the archivist often quoted poetry. She frowned, shook her head. No, never. And she added almost reluctantly that the archivist disliked the verse and considered it a distraction from the true record. I left her then, but the unease deepened. A woman who despised poetry had quoted it to me and quoted it wrong. Back in my room, I spread the fragments again. The letters, the receipt, the wine list, the photograph. They looked no closer to coherence than before. Yet the misquoted verse hung above them all, like a string pulled taut. Why quote a line you do not care for? Why quote it wrongly, unless you wished the listener to carry the wrong version in mind? Lewis came by with his steady presence and his quiet questions. He saw the papers spread across my desk, the photograph with its scarred thumb. He asked if I was building a case or dismantling one. I said neither. I told him I was trying to remember correctly. He looked at me as though I were confessing to something larger than I meant. He said memory is a dangerous witness. I said nothing, though I thought of the student long dead, the shoes unlaced, the lamp extinguished and relit. When he left, I opened the crossword. The clue read, truth twisted into error, 9 letters. I tried to fake it, then distortion. At last I wrote a misquote. Too neat, perhaps, but sometimes neatness is the truth's disguise. On Sunday morning I returned to the archives. The air inside was colder than the streets, as though the stones had absorbed winter and refused to release it. The archivist greeted me with her usual severity, but there was the faintest tremor in her hands. I asked about the photograph again. She said curtly that all records were as they were, and that scholars should not impose patterns where there were none. I asked if she remembered quoting Milton to me. She stiffened. She said she had not. It was not denial that troubled me, but the speed of it, too fast as though prepared. Her thumb rested against the desk, the scar pale against her skin. I realized then what unsettled me most. The scar was not old. It was fresh, half-healed, as though from a recent cut. The photograph could not have shown it decades earlier, unless the photograph itself had been altered. A thumb added where none had been, a quiet intrusion to confuse. I asked nothing further. She dismissed me with a look that belonged more to a magistrate than a custodian of records. I walked out into the mist, unsettled not only by her denial, but by the possibility that the archives themselves had been manipulated. That night, I sat with my whiskey and the misquoted verse. Light after darkness or darkness after light, a reversal so slight that few would notice, yet enough to change the meaning entirely. Had the archivist placed the scarred thumb in the photograph? Had she misquoted Milton to me so I would misremember the day's details? Was she the one curating not history but illusion? Oxford thrives on illusion. Its stones persuade you, of permanence even as they crumble. Its records convince you of certainty even as they contradict. And its people are masters at offering the wrong verse with just enough conviction to be believed. The lantern is gone now. The canal had offered its false body. The photograph had given me a scar that should not exist. The archivist had misquoted a poet she despised. Each clue, each fragment could be dismissed. Yet together they gathered into a pressure I could no longer ignore. I closed the crossword, unfinished. The clue for that night remained unanswered. A lie dressed as memory, 10 letters. I left it blank, though I thought of one possible word, fabrication. I extinguished the light and let the darkness remain. Sometimes the only way to hear the truth is to sit in the silence it has left behind. It was on Monday morning that I discovered the absence. I had returned to the archives again, though by then I was scarcely certain whether I was following the case or whether the case had begun to follow me. The room smelled as always of dust and disuse, the faint odour of old polish clinging to the oak like the aftertaste of a vanished dinner. The archivist was not present, though I half expected her at every turn. It was her absence that first gave me the courage to request the file once more. The folder arrived with its usual neat twine, but I knew at once something was different. A bundle lighter, a spine thinner. I opened it carefully, each page stiff, as though resisting me. And there it was, the report of the student's death, now without its marginal note. The line about the letter recovered and claimed gone, as though it had never existed. There is a kind of violence in absence, more so than in presence. A word scratched out, a photograph cropped, a page removed. It is always the silence that damns. I stared at the gap where the note had been, and the memory of it burned stronger than the ink ever had. It was not a failing of memory. I had seen it once. It had been there. I closed the folder, but the weight of that absence remained. Someone had been in the file after me. Someone who understood the value not of evidence, but of erasure. I left the archives unsettled, my steps hollow against the flagstones. The drizzle had thickened, tapping the glass of shop fronts like impatient fingers. I stopped at the Bodleian, where the assistant sat behind her desk with eyes that had grown duller by the day. Asked if files were ever altered. She looked at me sharply, then away. No, she said. Never. She spoke too quickly, her hand fussing with the catalogue as if to dismiss the question physically. I thought of her cuff, ink-stained days before, of the letter that had fallen from her books, of the photograph with the scar that did not belong. Always fragments, always small betrayals. Lewis joined me later for lunch. He spoke of football again, of the folly of managers who mistook noise for strategy. I let him talk. He asked eventually why I looked so tired. I said only that Oxford was thinning me out, pulling me into its corners. He said Oxford had been doing that to me for years. He said I would not know who I was without its corridors. I laughed, though it sounded to me like something breaking. That evening I spread the papers again. The wine list, the letters, the receipt, the photograph. And now the absence of the missing page. How does one spread an absence on a desk? Only in the imagination. I placed a blank sheet of paper between the others and stared at it as though it might yield words. The crossword sat open beside me. The clue gone without trace 7 letters. I tried deleting it. At last I wrote something missing. Too plain, too childlike, but true. Missing page, missing lantern, missing man, missing truth. The whiskey tasted bitterer than usual. Perhaps my mouth had grown too accustomed to it. I returned to the archives the next morning, determined not to let the silence fester. The archivist was there this time, her eyes flat, her thumb scar glistening faintly where the skin had cracked again. I asked directly about the missing page. She said there was no missing page. She said the file was complete. Her voice held the authority of stone. I wanted to press further, but something in her gaze stopped me. Not fear, not guilt. Something harder, determination perhaps, or belief. The belief that history is not what is written but what is preserved, and preservation can mean erasure as much as inclusion. I left without another word. That night I walked through Oxford's lanes in the drizzle. The lantern was gone still, its bracket empty, its absence growing heavier with each evening. I stopped by the canal where the red herring had been offered, the water sluggish under the faint light of the lamps. I thought of the vagrant's body, anonymous, forgotten already. I thought of the student, dead at his desk, his shoes unlaced. I thought of the librarian, vanished into silence, and of myself, written in faint pencil among the suspects on a wine list, a missing page, a misquoted verse, a photograph altered, a lantern extinguished. I carried them all like stones in my pocket. I returned to my rooms, dripping rain onto the floorboards, and sat with the crossword again. Another clue, a record rewritten, 12 letters. I wrote fabrication, then crossed it out. I wrote manipulation, too long. At last I wrote an alteration. It fits. But the word did not soothe. The missing page haunted me. Not for what it said, but for what it refused to say. Someone had decided that the memory of a letter unclaimed, unexplained, was too dangerous to remain, and so they had tried to erase it. But erasure is never clean. Absence has a shadow, and shadows are sometimes the only truth we have left. It was Tuesday evening when I realised the circle would have to close, whether I wished it or not. Oxford does not permit mysteries to linger indefinitely. It consumes them, digests them, and leaves only the bones. And yet, for once, I felt less like the observer than the observed. Every corridor seemed to narrow toward me. Every whisper of rain against the glass seemed to insist upon a reckoning. The invitation came not in words, but in silence. The assistant, pale and restless, slipped a folded slip of paper onto the desk as she handed me a catalogue entry. It contained no writing, only a faint pencil cross in the centre. I understood it for what it was. That night I walked to the old reading room where the student had once been found, his hand curled around Milton. The Bodleian was locked, of course, but Oxford's locks are old, and its walls are generous to those who know how to walk them. I found myself inside, the smell of leather and age surrounding me like a cloak. They were there already. The assistant, her hands trembling as she tried to steal them on the polished wood of the table. The archivist, rigid, her thumb scar more visible under the harsh light. And the young woman, seated in the shadows, her face pale but defiant. The librarian's chair was empty. I said nothing at first. The silence belonged to them. The assistant spoke eventually. She said the lantern had been hers to light, that she had done so on instruction. She would not say from whom. She insisted the flame had been meant only as a signal, not as a sentence. Her voice cracked when she said it, but the words remained. The young woman leaned forward. She spoke of her brother, the student who died so many years ago. She said his death had never been as simple as the coroner claimed. She said a letter had been written, recovered, and hidden. She said debts had remained unpaid, debts of silence more than of money. Her eyes fixed on me as if I had been complicit all along. The archivist listened, her face a mask carved from stone. When she finally spoke, it was only to say that records are fragile things, that history is what survives, not what occurs. She admitted to removing the page, admitted to altering the photograph, and admitted to misquoting Milton. She called it necessary. She said truth is not always preservation, sometimes it is obliteration. The assistant wept quietly. The young woman glared. The archivist folded her hands with finality. And me? I listened. For once I had nothing clever to add, no deduction to pin neatly to the wall, only fragments, half-truths. The circle had closed, yes, but around what? I thought again of the crossword, the clue I had left blank the night before, a lie dressed as memory, 10 letters. The answer came to me now as though whispered by the stone walls themselves. Reminiscence. Not always true, not always false. A lie, a truth, or both. I asked them each quietly what they believed the debt to be. The assistant said guilt. The young woman said in silence. The archivist said survival. 3 answers, none. Sufficient. I walked home through the rain, the lantern bracket empty, the city darker than I had ever seen it. Later, in my room, I poured the last of the whiskey. I spread the fragments one final time. The wine list, the letters, the receipt, the photograph, and the blank page. They looked no closer to coherence, and yet together they made a pattern, not a solution, but a confession of sorts. The confession of a city that writes its history in absence as much as in presence. I finished the crossword slowly. The final clue read, End without resolution. 7 letters. I wrote a closure, then hesitated. I crossed it out. I wrote in silence. That fits better. I closed the book, in case it remained unfinished. The debts, if debts they were, remained unmeasured. And yet the lantern was extinguished. The circle had gathered, and Oxford would move on. Perhaps that was all the ending it intended to give me. I sat in the dimness, the whiskey gone, the rain continuing its quiet recital against the glass, and felt the weight of everything unresolved. Even now, years later, I still see that missing page more clearly than any that remain. Confession is never the end. It is only another silence shaped differently. I realised this the morning after the gathering, when Oxford woke damp and grey, the rain leaving faint silver trails down the windows of my rooms. I had expected some final relief, perhaps, or the faint thrill of having reached a conclusion. Instead, there was only the ache of unfinished business, the kind of ache that clings even when no case remains. The archivist had spoken her truth. The assistant had spoken hers. The young woman had carried her grief into words that refused to settle. But each confession felt less like clarity and more like smoke. They had told me what they believed, not what had happened, and belief, I know, is as dangerous as any lie. I walked through Broad Street that morning, the stones slick with rain, the bicycles chained like prisoners to iron rails. A student hurried past with a book clutched to his chest, his hair dripping, his expression earnest. I thought of the dead student years ago, his shoes unlaced, his hand still on Milton. Was his death anything more than an accident, long embroidered into tragedy? Or had I, and those around me, needed it to be something more? At the Bodleian, the assistant sat at her desk. She did not look up when I approached. I asked softly whether the lantern had been hers alone to light. She said nothing. Her silence was not refusal, but exhaustion. I let her be. Later, Lewis joined me for a pint. He eyed me carefully, as he always did when he sensed the shadows pressing too close. He asked what had been settled. I told him nothing had been. He said then it was time to let it go. Oxford would not thank me for digging in its bones. I laughed, though without humour, and asked if he'd ever known me to let go of anything. He said no, and that was the trouble. But he did not press further. He talked instead of the match on Saturday, of a niece's birthday, of the ordinary things that tether men to the ground. I listened without listening, grateful for his persistence, even as my mind drifted back to the photograph, the scar, the missing page. That night I returned to my room and unfolded the fragments again. The letters, the receipt, the wine list, the photograph, the blank page that marked an absence. They looked absurd laid out in the lamplight, like props from a play without dialogue, yet together they still carried weight, the weight of stories half told. The crossword lay open before me. The clue read, "What remains after confession?" 10 letters. I tried absolution, then crossed it out. I wrote punishment, then shook my head. At last I wrote the aftermath. It fits neatly, and it felt right. After the confession, there is always the aftermath. The following morning I visited Jericho. The canal was quiet, the water sluggish, reflecting the dull sky. The tape had been taken down, the death of the vagrant already absorbed into Oxford's long history of overlooked endings. No one lingered there. A dog sniffed at the edge, its owner tugging it away with impatience. I thought of the red herring again, and how even a false trail leaves its mark. A man was still dead, whatever the intention. I walked back slowly through the lanes, their brickwork damp, their windows glowing faintly with Sunday lamps. It struck me then that Oxford itself was the culprit. It had written the death into its architecture, altered the photograph, erased the page, misquoted the verse. It had been preserved and obliterated in equal measure. The people were only its instruments, speaking the words it required. When I reached the archives again, the archivist was waiting. She looked at me without greeting, her thumb scar pale under the light. She said only this history is never what you think it is. It is only what survives. Then she turned and left me with the files, untouched, incomplete. I opened them once more. The missing page was still missing. The photograph still bore the scar. I stared at them until my eyes blurred. Then I closed the folder, tied the twine, and left it where it belonged. Back in my room, I poured the last measure of whiskey. The rain struck the glass steadily, patiently as time. I thought again of the lantern. Its glow had begun everything. Its absence had ended it. Illumination that conceals. I finished the crossword. The final clue read, "An ending without finality. 7 letters." I wrote an epilogue. It fits too easily. But then perhaps that is what Oxford gives us, epilogues instead of endings. I extinguished the lamp, sat in the silence, and let the city breathe around me. Even now, when I walk past that bracket where the lantern once burned, I half expect to see its glow return, not because the case demands it, but because memory does. Memory never allows the flame to go out completely. After the confession, only silence remains, but silence too has a voice. It was late in the term when the Radcliffe camera seemed to glow unnaturally, as if the stone itself had absorbed centuries of light and was giving it back reluctantly. I had wandered there in the evening, the drizzle faint, the lamps along Cat Street shimmering against the wet cobbles. The dome loomed above me like a lantern itself, its glass panes lit unevenly, some bright, others shadowed, the whole building flickering like a memory uncertain of its own truth. I had not intended to return to that place, but Oxford arranges its paths so that one always circles back, and that night the city felt hushed, as though it were listening to me rather than the other way around. Inside, the air was thick with the musk of paper. Students bent over their desks, their pens moving steadily, each absorbed in his or her own narrow task. Yet beneath that industrious murmur, there was another sound, a faint whisper. Not words exactly, but the suggestion of breath. I have never believed in ghosts, though I have often walked in their company, and there, beneath the Radcliffe's dome, I felt their presence more keenly than I had in years. I chose a seat near the window, the stone cold against my shoulder. I laid out the crossword from that morning's Times. The clue read, "That which lingers, unheard yet present, 8 letters. I tried echoes, then residu. Neither fit. At last I wrote whispers. The word seemed to settle into the grid as though it had been waiting. Whispers. The archivist's false verse, the assistant's silence, the young woman's grief pressed into accusation, the librarian's absence more eloquent than his presence could have been. Whispers, all of them. Across the room, I noticed the young woman again, the one who had dropped the receipt. She was not reading now, but staring at the dome above, her eyes unfocused, her lips moving faintly as though reciting something unheard. I watched her long enough to see that her hands trembled slightly, though she clenched them in her lap to disguise it. When she rose, a slip of paper fell from her notebook. Instinct or habit drove me to retrieve it. I bent and read only a fragment before she turned back, startled. She let me keep it, as though surrendering a burden. The words were written in the same hurried hand as the letters. The light will not last. Remember him. I folded it into my pocket. I did not look at her again. Outside, the dome loomed brighter, the lamps along the street casting its curve into sharp relief. Radcliffe had always reminded me of an eye, one that observed and recorded but never judged. That night it felt more like a witness unwilling to speak. Lewis joined me later, his coat damp, his hair untidy. He asked what I'd been doing, and I said only that I had been reading. He laughed softly and said that in Oxford, everyone was always reading, yet no one ever seemed to know what the words meant. I told him perhaps the meaning was not in the words, but in the gaps between them. He gave me that look he reserves for when he believes I'm drifting too far into abstraction. He said simply, "Be careful." Back in my room, I spread the fragments one last time. The letters, the receipt, the wine list, the photograph, the missing page, and now this final slip from the Radcliffe. Each seemed absurd in isolation. Together they hummed with a kind of dissonance like a chord never resolved. I poured whiskey, the bottle nearly empty. The rain had quickened outside, rattling faintly against the panes. I stared at the dome through the glass, its light still flickering. It looked less like certainty and more like a warning. The crossword lay before me. Another clue. Knowledge that conceals as much as it reveals. 9 letters. I wrote learning, then crossed it out. I wrote archives. Wrong again. At last I wrote ignorance. It fits. Oxford's cruel trick that ignorance might be preserved in the guise of knowledge. In the small hours I returned once more to the Radcliffe. The lamps along the street had dimmed, the drizzle turned to mist. The doors should have been locked, but I found them open, the vast reading room empty. The silence was immense, heavy enough to press against the skin. I walked slowly among the desks. Each chair seemed to hold an echo of its last occupant, a faint warmth in the wood, a memory of restless hands. I paused beneath the dome, its ceiling lit by the faintest glow, and listened. Not to the rustle of pages or the creak of chairs, but to something else. A whisper, low, indistinct, like the last breath of a voice that had not finished speaking. It might have been the wind, it might have been memory, it might have been nothing at all. But I felt then, with a certainty I could not explain, that Oxford would never yield its truth entirely. The lantern would glow and extinguish, the pages appear and vanish, the verses be misquoted, the photographs altered. And I would continue to circle them, never closing the grid, only filling its blanks with words that almost fit. When dawn came, the Radcliffe's dome blushed faintly against the grey sky. I walked out into the empty street, the stones wet beneath my shoes, and thought again of the crossword clue I had left unfinished, that which remains after the light fades, 7 letters. I wrote it later in my room, my pen pressing harder than usual against the paper. Shadow. Yes, that was the word. Oxford lives in its shadows, and so do I. The whispers remain, carried in the Radcliffe light, refusing to be silenced.